In this video, I want to talk a little bit about how the heart muscle contracts in order to send the blood around your body. Remember that your heart is a four-chambered muscular structure about the size of your fist that is inside your thoracic cavity, sitting just above your diaphragm behind your sternum or your breastbone. It is comprised of cardiac muscle, one of the three types of muscle, and the heart is the only place where we find cardiac muscle. Cardiac muscle can contract independently of the central nervous system, but of course, your brain is very important in controlling, upregulating, or downregulating your natural heartbeat. And the heart pushes the blood through two different circuits. It sends deoxygenated blood to the lungs through the pulmonary circuit in order to oxygenate that blood to pick up, to do the gas exchange and exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide, and then pumps that oxygenated blood around to the entire body on the systemic loop or the systemic circuit. Here's a microscope slide of some heart muscle tissue. You can see it's striated like the muscle tissue that we see in our skeleton, and that there are these special connections between heart muscle cells called intercalated discs that speed up the communication between cells so that they can contract more efficiently together. In order for the heart to contract, we have to have an electrical signal go through the heart, similar to the electrical signal that goes down through your nerves or through any of your skeletal muscles to contract them. And actually, your heart has two muscle contraction units because both your atrium and ventricles need to contract separately. And so the heart is designed so that they can contract independent of each other. There is a special structure known as the sinoatrial node, which starts the contraction of the heart, and it sends this electrical impulse through the atria, through to the atrioventricular node, the AV node, in order to then pass it down to the ventricles. The AV node sends the impulse to the ventricles going down through the interventricular septum, so down the center of the heart and back up the sides. And this path allows the muscle bundles to be arranged in a way that will push blood down from the atria and then up and out of the heart from the ventricles as the nerve muscles move through the heart muscle tissue. This diagram shows the pathway of the nerve impulses through the heart, starting, of course, in the SA node, which is the heart's natural pacemaker. The impulse here will first reach out and go through the right and left atria. And then because there is a thick layer of fibrous connective tissue at the bottom of the atriums, you will have the nerve signals basically be stopped. They're not able to go through. It's kind of like insulation on your wires. And so the impulses have to kind of be consolidated in the AV node, the atrioventricular node, and from there they go down special fibers that will travel down through the interventricular septum. They will split right and left and then go on to transfer this nerve impulse to all of the cardiac muscle tissue on the right and left ventricles. Of course, your cardiac muscle tissue is a little bit thicker on the left-hand side than is shown in this diagram. It's about 3 times thicker than the right side, but these diagrams are not showing that accurately. Those particular fibers that carry the nerve impulse through the ventricles are Purkinje fibers, and they are because they go down through the center of the heart, we get a contraction that's actually going to start here down at the bottom and allow the heart then to push the blood, as I said, up and out of the heart. So the pattern of contraction and then after contraction relaxation is put together in a reoccurring pattern known as the cardiac cycle. When the heart is contracted or any part of the heart is contracted, the scientific word for that is systole or systole, and the relaxation time is diastole or diastole. So you'll hear the words pronounced both ways. When you listen to your heartbeat with a stethoscope, you can hear 2 distinct sounds. And they are described various ways, but I'm going to use the terms lub-dub. Just like when you open a door, it's very easy to open a door quietly. You can't really slam a door open, but you can slam a door shut. So like opening and closing a door, more noise will happen when the something shuts. And the noises that we are hearing for our heartbeat are things shutting inside the heart. The first sound, the lub sound, happens as your atrioventricular valves, those tricuspid and bicuspid or mitral valves between the atria and ventricles, as they are closing as pressure builds up in the ventricles as they start to contract. And then the second sound, the dup sound, is the sound we hear when the semilunar valves at the end of the pulmonary trunk and the aorta close shut as the blood that has been pushed into those large blood vessels relaxes back a little bit towards the heart, and these valves close so that there will be no backflow of blood. The pressure is dropping during the ventricles at this time because the heart is relaxing. We don't really hear a heartbeat sound as the atria contract to move blood from the atria into the ventricles because there's not any door that closes at that point. Here's a diagram that tries to take you through that process. So we're actually going to start down here. So when the atria contract, the blood that has been collecting in the right and left atria, both coming from the lungs and from the body, has been pushing. It's actually, it kind of trickles down into the ventricles originally. Gravity is going to be pulling it there as everything is relaxed and the AV valves are open. But as the atria contract, then you have a more forceful push of blood into the ventricle. So the AV valves are open because they only close when there's pressure from the bottom. So they're letting the blood flow in from the atria down into the ventricles. The semilunar valves are closed because they only work one way as blood moves into them, and so blood cannot go backwards, and so they're shut so that blood will not go backwards. Then we get our contraction of the ventricles. So the second, moving around our cardiac cycle diagram here, the contraction of the ventricles will push the blood either into the pulmonary trunk to go to the lungs or into the aorta to go out in the body. That contraction is going to cause the AV valves to close off, and so then you're going to hear that lub sound as those valves slam shut by this upward pressure caused by the inward squeezing of the ventricles. So when your ventricles go into systole, to force the blood out of the heart, we have the AV valves close, we hear our first heart sound, and blood is sent either to the lungs or to the body. At this time, as the blood moves into these large blood vessels, the semilunar valves and the aortic valve are going to be open, but then they're going to close off as soon as the ventricles start to relax. So the blood is filling these vessels, but we don't want it coming back. The back pressure of the blood that just has been pumped into those large vessels will close the semilunar valves, and that semilunar valve closing will give us our second sound, or our dub sound. And then at this point, your atria and ventricles are relaxing. The blood is refilling in the atrium and getting in the two atrium, right and left atrium, and then getting ready to be sent into the ventricles by the contraction of the atria. But again, this is the quiet side of the cardiac cycle. That's that lub-dub pause, lub-dub pause. There's a brief pause that is happening as the relaxed heart is filling with blood, and then the atria are contracting in order to send the blood into the ventricles. So your heart rate, how fast your heart is beating, typically is somewhere between 60 and 100 beats per minute. This is called your natural pacemaker. The SA node sends out a signal of about somewhere in that range. Because it's such a large range, because your age will affect how fast your heart beats, your fitness level. Athletes have a lower heartbeat because their heart has been trained and it's more efficient at pumping blood. In times of stress, your heart rate tends to be elevated, and certain medications can affect the heart both in a positive or a negative, or the heart rate in a positive or negative directions. So you have this base rate. The heart will continue to beat regardless of what's going on outside, but many things in the environment are going to change your heart rate based on your needs or what's happening right now. Are you sleeping? Are you running? What's happening? And so those kinds of changes are going to be regulated by your sympathetic or parasympathetic nervous system, depending on whether you're moving into a state of excitement and arousal and stress or in a more relaxed time. Other things that can affect your heart rate include imbalances of electrolytes, such as potassium or calcium, and the overall strength of the contraction, how fit your heart is, how well it is able to contract. If it's good at contracting, it doesn't have to contract as much, which is why athletes tend to have lower heart rates. And just how well it synchronizes its overall rhythm. If you're someone who has a irregular heartbeat, either because of a congenital condition or because of some injury that's happened with age, that will affect your ability for your heart to contract and will affect your heart rate. We measure our heart rate typically through our pulse. And the pulse can be taken at a variety of sites. If the heart at rest is above 100 beats per minute on a regular basis, a person is said to have tachycardia. And if it's below 60 beats per minute, then you have bradycardia. And then, of course, irregular heartbeat of any type is an arrhythmia. And sometimes this can be an indication of a serious heart condition. Here are some of the common places where you're able to feel a pulse. Probably the ones you're most familiar are the ones for the radial artery taken down at the wrist and the carotid artery, which can be found on either side of your trachea, since you have a right and left carotid artery in your neck running right beside your windpipe. But it's also usually fairly easy to feel the brachial artery, and some people have good luck in feeling some of these other pulse points as well. The fact that you can feel a pulse all the way down here in the foot on the dorsalis pedis artery is letting you know that the pressure from the heart, as the heart here in the middle of the chest is pushing out blood, it is pushing it out in a wave of blood. And that wave basically is going to travel through the body. And it is strong enough so it is still making arteries expand all the way down at the end of your foot. Along with having your heart rate or your pulse checked regularly at the doctor's office, and doctors often are listening to your heart sounds with a stethoscope, you may at some point in your life experience an electrocardiogram or an ECG. You sometimes also see this as EKG. And the ECG records the change in electrical potential that occur during in the heart muscle layer, which is known as the myocardium, during the cardiac cycle. Because in order for the contraction to occur, if you remember back to how our nervous system works, there was a depolarization that happened, that the positive and negative charges, the difference between the positive and negative charges inside and outside of a nerve cell would change as that electrical impulse moved down the nerve cell. The same thing happens in muscle cells, that you have a movement of positive ions that will change the electrical potential across the cell membrane of your heart muscle cells. And this can be measured, this electrical change can be measured by an ECG. It is helpful for assessing the heart's ability to conduct these nerve impulses through the muscle. So it's a way of seeing how well is the muscle responding, are impulses being transmitted, is the heart contracting in response. The wave is a very familiar shape. We'll be looking at it on the next slide, but you know that it has some ups or downs, and the ups or downs are given letters. So we have a P wave, which is corresponding to the impulse traveling through the atria, or the atria depolarization, and contraction occurs about halfway through that time period. Then the QRS complex, which covers all of the contraction of the ventricles. And again, the actual contraction starts about halfway through that wave, so far as time is concerned. And then the T wave, that is telling you when your ventricles are going into that relaxation stage, and the impulses are basically going to a resetting so that the heart can contract again, and nerve impulses can be distributed again. So looking at this very common pattern, here's our P wave, this little bump that happens before this really big change from a straight line, and then a T wave afterwards. Here we have the illustration that I'm sure you have seen, sort of your basic heartbeat pattern. And so we have this tiny P wave in the beginning, the big QRS complex, and then the T wave afterwards. So to correspond it with the different contraction parts in the heart muscle itself, you can see the P wave is going to correspond with atrial contraction, and the actual contraction will not start at the beginning of the P wave because that's when depolarization is just beginning. We have to get to a threshold, and the threshold occurs somewhere in the center of this wave time-wise. The way the EKGs are set up, of course, time is passing as you move down the paper. So this would be like at time 0, and then this would be a certain amount of seconds afterwards. Then in your QRS complex, again, you can see we've got the contraction of the ventricle happening. And again, that's going to happen, somewhere in the middle of that time-wise. And then as it repolarizes, as the nerve impulse basically resets the nerve cells and the muscle tissue, you have the T wave where the heart is recovering, getting ready for the next heartbeat. We'll be doing a lab where you're going to be taking a look at some ECG printouts and trying to evaluate what's going on. But you can see, each of these boxes here is representing a certain amount of time. So with these waves being close together, that tells you there's a fast heartbeat. Here's a slower heartbeat than the normal one on top. And in this case, we have, short and long spacing telling you that someone has an irregular heartbeat. So to check for understanding, can you map the pattern of contraction through the heart? Where does it start? Where does it go next? Can you describe how heart rate is regulated? What makes it faster or slower? And can you distinguish an abnormal ECG wave pattern from a normal one?